All right.
Professor Duchesne, thank you so much. I love the book, The Uniqueness of Western Civilization. It's a very important book for me. The first question I'd really want to ask you is, why do you feel it's so significant to trace the origins of the West to the Indo-Europeans rather than, say, the Greeks, as many would do, or even some people would trace the origins of the West to Christianity, really
Right.
gaining a hold over Europeans and particularly European governments? What is it about the Europeans and their more, well, if I could paraphrase you, restless creativity and libertarian spirit and their aristocratic, warlike culture? What is it about those characteristics that you feel really undergirds
Yes.
European characteristics?
Okay, I came to the realization that the Indo-Europeans were important quite late in my investigation of the uniqueness of Western civilization. Like every scholar I had read, the tendency was to go as far back as the ancient Greek period. And I also note in the book that recently there has been a tendency to actually move forward the rise of the West debate, to argue that the West only diverged, which is a word that came into prominence a few years ago, that the West diverged only with the Industrial Revolution. And then some scholars will go back to the rise of modern science and then connect modern science to the Industrial Revolution. But some don't connect it and think it can be traced back just to the Industrial Revolution. So the argument is that really the West was quite similar to other civilizations up until the 18th century. And they think that what made the West different was the rise of modern industry, the ability of Europeans to employ a new source of energy, inorganic source of energy like coal, and invent machines that could use that kind of energy. So that was the tendency when I was looking into this issue. And in many ways, I did the opposite. Rather than just going back to modern science or even to the ancient Greek period, I went even before the ancient Greek period. So it really went against the grain that the West was a very recent phenomenon, the uniqueness of the West. Now, as I was saying at the beginning, it was only after many years of investigating this question that it just dawned on me that there was something before the Greeks, that you cannot generate the dynamism you see in Western culture simply by looking at philosophers and artists sitting down quietly doing their work, that it wasn't simply a matter of an institutional framework allowing for freer, more creative human to do the kind of things we associate with the West. But there had to be something that is not even rational, that is in some ways instinctive. And in my book, I have a quote from Nietzsche, which I looked at today. I was just scrolling through the book, and he has this statement, which he wrote in his book, Daybreak. He says, all things that live for a long time gradually become so saturated with reason that their origin in non-reason thereby comes to be seen improbable. And in many ways, this is what had happened with the investigation on the origins of the West. We tend to think that, well, what makes the West a great civilization are those things we associate with being civilized, with reason, with universities, with laws. So the West moved away from unreason, from instinct, from violence. Then it rose, then it became different, it became creative. Whereas I was getting influenced by Nietzsche and other philosophers who look at the irrational, instinctive basis of human creativity. And it just struck me, the Europeans, people were not looking at them. And here I see a group of people who are very vital, energetic. They engage in a unique style of warfare known as berserker warfare. They actually expanded right from the what is today present-day Ukraine, and expanded all through the Near East, right into Europe, all the way into Western Europe. And so it was really like a very quick thing. In a matter of a few months, it was just like, yes, this is it. If you really want to get back to the very origins of the West, you have to look at these people, which, as I just said, did in fact expand, did in fact colonize the whole of Europe. And when you read this literature, the scholars, they're not really examining the uniqueness of the West at large, they're just looking at the Indo-Europeans. But when you read the foremost scholars on the Indo-Europeans, you notice that they're identifying certain traits with them. First is this expansion. Second is that they Europeanized or Indo-Europeanized Europe, all Europe, whereas they did not the Near East. Secondly, that they were very warlike, aggressive, and while they now agree it wasn't some sort of massive military occupation of Europe, the expansion of the Europeans happened through a long period of time via small movements, through various cultures. In other words, it isn't one unified, homogeneous culture of Indo-Europeans that just takes over Europe, but rather as they move, they develop different cultural characteristics, different linguistic patterns, and so you see them sort of moving through the corded wear, the bell beaker culture. And so examining these kinds of things, I said, well, why is it that everyone has been ignoring these people? And really, the main reason is that the Indo-Europeans have come to be associated with the Aryan race, if you like, with the Aryan hypothesis.
Yes.
And so when I contacted a few experts, they did seem very reluctant to get into the importance of the Indo-Europeans as far as the origins of the West was concerned. It wasn't even an issue that they were addressing. And they were even less willing to engage me if I started talking about their aristocratic spirit, because this was another thing that I noticed about them, is that when you read the literature, the authors keep using this term aristocratic when it comes to the Mycenaeans, who are Indo-Europeans who established themselves in ancient Greece. I noticed that every book will say these people were very aristocratic, very warlike. They don't say that about the Minoans, for example. And while it is true that, yes, there were aristocracies elsewhere, they seem to be saying that there was something different about the Indo-Europeans, that they were thoroughly aristocratic. And if you ask them, so what makes the aristocratic character of the Indo-Europeans different from that of the other aristocracies in other cultures, they don't know why. But when you read the literature carefully, I started realizing that, yes, there is something that is truly aristocratic about the Europeans, and that is that we have an elite that rules the society and they select a leader, but that leader is always seen as someone who's equal to them. And there is a term, first among equals.
Yes.
And
Yes.
there is a sense that we are all peers. I started noticing also psychology among this class, very, not just aggressive, because the word aggressive has this negative connotation today, whereas I don't see that negative connotation in the way that people see it today. But it wasn't just aggressive, but it was very spirited, very proud, that they don't want to submit. When I study the Macedonian army and its expansion into Persia, and this is in the literature, in biographies of Alexander the Great, you will notice that in every biography they bring up this incident in which Alexander the Great started appropriating Persian customs, wanted his peers to see him as a god,
Yes. Yes.
yeah, to bow down to him. And, the Macedonian elite, the aristocracy, was kind of laughing it off, like, who do you think we are? Like, this is comical that you're expecting us to kneel down before you. And he would get angry and sort of, because he was himself a typical aristocratic man that wanted to hide or reach such a high level of achievement. That in itself always sets you up into conflict with other people, because you become very preoccupied. Are they really recognizing me? recognizing me? Do they really validate what I have done? So he becomes obsessive about that. No matter how much he does, he needs to be validated by his peers. And then in Persia, he starts appropriating this Eastern style of being worshipped, which goes against the aristocratic spirit. And so that's why the aristocracy, the Macedonian aristocracy, began to rebel against him. So you can see it there in the literature again, that there is this sense among European authors in ancient times that there was something unique aristocratic about the Macedonians or the ancient Greeks. And then in my book, I take it into Roman history. And one of the things that I do as well is that I connect this aristocratic spirit, which existed in a kind of primitive tribal state of government organization, and then I show how that was connected and influenced the rise of democratic government in ancient Greece and republican government in Rome, and then connected as well to the feudalistic form of government that you find in medieval times, all the way into representative institutions. But it's a complicated argument. It's not as if you can take a linear analysis or a linear way of thinking and saying that from a tribal aristocratic form of government, you inevitably get to a representative form of government. Because what is happening once you get into the representative form of government is that this aristocratic spirit is now spreading beyond a small elite. You can already see this in ancient Greece, where there is a sense in which if the members of the Greek city-state, and the Greek city-state is now, when we're talking about the classical period, when they're engaging in wars with Persia, that if these members of the city-state of Greece are all participating in these wars, are all committed to it, and all see themselves as participants, they are also given more, should I say, democratic rights to participate in the government, to express their viewpoints, and are considered to be citizens and free men. So this aristocratic spirit, if you like, filters down into other segments of the population. Nevertheless, Greece still remains very aristocratic in the sense that you do have a very wealthy, more powerful class at the top that tends to dominate politics. And when you look at the great thinkers and the great military statesmen, they tend to come primarily from the upper levels of the Greek society. But there is this filtering down that you see in the West, and that's a complicated thing that takes a while to talk about.
It's a very complicated subject. I think you argue it tremendously well in your book. As you say, there are lots of variables involved, but nevertheless, generally speaking, we could say that the Indo-Europeans, because of this competitive spirit and this desire for prestige among one's peers, they, rather than insisting that others would bow down to them, which was the Eastern trait, and perhaps with all other cultures, one could say, around the world, the Indo-Europeans having that attitude was a sort of precursor for experiments in individual liberty, which would then take place in the Greek city-states, and later with Rome and other constitutional forms of government. It's not an exact succession of these things, and like you say, it's not very simple.
Right.
But there is a very clear distinction, as you say, between what was going on in the West, or Europe really, and in the East. But what I found especially interesting was how you connected the Indo-European competitive spirit with the miracle of Greece, so the birth of the pursuit of individual freedom and rational truth in Greece.
Right.
And the way that began to arise from the poetic recounting of the heroic deeds of the aristos, the heroes, as it were.
Yes, in the prehistoric oral literature, poetry of the Indo-Europeans, which has been reconstructed. There are books now that have segments of this oral Indo-European poetry already there, and it goes back to millennia BC. Already there, you see proto-individualism there. You see it in this oral literature, then you see it expressed in later literature, the Iliad. You see it there. You see it in Beowulf, the Icelandic sagas, Scandinavian sagas.
Right.
Right, and what you see there is not the modern form of individualism, but you see various characteristics that are uniquely Indo-European. I have written about this because some people have asked and have said, well, look, this heroic militaristic ethos that you talk about, you will find it in other literature, not just in European literature. And they will say, well, at least you're going to find it in the literature of the Mongolian peoples or the Turkic peoples in their own epics. And I did read about this more recently. I had not done this as much or practically not at all in the book, but I read more recently about this Turkic Mongolian epic literature. And you do see some basic distinctions which show that in the epic in European literature, there is a higher degree of individualism. Not only do you have an author with an individual name, like Homer, and you do have it in other literature, but the characters in the drama are identified, their names are identified. I noticed when I was reading the Iliad that every major warrior will be identified by name, his family, where he lives. And so there is this individualistic authorship, that there is an author, that there is a person that has certain personality characteristics that you can identify with a particular name. And now it is true that at that time we're still talking about a tribal, very collective oriented society. So it becomes kind of difficult to distinguish the kind of collectivism you still see in the prehistoric Indo-Europeans and the Greeks and the medieval werewolf people and that of other people. But I think it can be done in one way, as I just said, is this sense of there being an author. Also, it's by looking at the narrative stories. They're more complex, they're richer in character. They describe, I mentioned, for example, the Vinland sagas, which it chronicles the adventures of Eric the Red and how he explored North America. And so here we have a person with an identifiable name who is being portrayed as a heroic figure, and it happens to be this particular individual who performed these deeds, and people are remembering him as an individual that stands out, that does things that nobody else has done. And so one of the things that then I do in the book, and this is in many ways possibly the most complicated side of the argument that I present, and that I haven't returned back to it since I wrote the book, but I do hope in the near future to return to it, which is that I argue that the first personalities, the first men with a sense of self-consciousness, emerge from this kind of individualistic pursuit of heroism. And here I employ philosophical arguments, the idea of Kojève, of Hegel's concept of the fight to the death for pure prestige. And I argue that there was this kind of, in the writings of Locke and Hobbes, they talk about a state of nature, but they talk about a state of nature in a very general sense. So when I read this fight to the death for pure prestige in Hegel, I began to think that Hegel was getting to the idea that there was a unique state of nature for European peoples, and that unique state of nature consisted in this fight to the death for pure prestige, and it was a fight among aristocrats seeking prestige and honor. And that in that fight for prestige and honor, when you examine what it is that they're fighting for, it wasn't simply about economic gain. It wasn't about acquiring territory. I mean, that's part of it, acquiring more women, you might say luxuries and so on. But at the bottom of it, because they're risking their lives, is that they're willing to risk their life to fight right to the end as long as they can get that honor and prestige, which is an immaterial thing. It's something also that you can only get from another aristocrat.
Yes, yes.
Yes, and I get into Kojev and show limitations in Kojev because Kojev sort of doesn't really spend enough time examining this. That Kojev is more into the fact that once the aristocrat enslaves the other who he has defeated or who is unwilling to fight, then we get into a different dialectic that leads to the bourgeois egalitarianism that he valued Kojev. Whereas I argue that actually, before you get to that kind of master slave relationship, you have a master to master relationship that is
Yes,
very
yes.
important in history, and you see it among the Greeks and among the Romans. And so, why is Kojev just dismissing this and simply saying that the aristocrat becomes parasitic? And in our egalitarian society, every book I read on Hegel about this dialectic, they're always pushing the master slave and how the slave becomes the important person because we are a kind of slavish people nowadays. So the idea is, the aristocrat is just a parasite. He cannot be validated by the slave, but then the slave becomes the worker and he finds meaning in his work. And through his work, he rises up and creates useful things. And he becomes a bourgeois who then fights off the aristocracy and creates a bourgeois society. And yes, that does happen. But before that, you do have republican forms of government. You have entire empires created on the basis of master to master dialectic, which is what happens in Rome. So I begin to argue that in this master to master relationship, you witness the emergence of individuals who become self conscious of themselves and free themselves to some degree from a collectivism that engulfs them and traps them and doesn't allow them to think as individuals. So in ancient Greece, you see this as well. And I do show that from the berserker style of warfare, gradually to these kind of characters and personalities that you have in the Homeric literature, character of in the Iliad, I forget now his name, you have Hector and then you have Achilles.
Achilles,
So
yes.
from there, eventually, I show, I think in some detail, how this competitive spirit, this individualism, finds expression in a more peaceful way in the poetic context of the Greeks, in the philosophical infighting among the Greeks. I mean, you go back to the pre-Socratics, and in the pre-Socratics, you have so many philosophers, each expressing one viewpoint, and the one that comes after will express a viewpoint that is very different from his predecessor. Whereas in ancient Greece, you have a situation in which you have a major thinker like Confucius or the guy who's behind Taoism, and then it becomes like everybody else has to imitate to show reverence for that prior
Yes.
founding thinker. Whereas in ancient Greece, among the pre-Socratics, you will find an Anaxagoras saying something, and then Anaximander says something else, then Democritus and Parmenides and Protagoras, and they're all saying something different. And this is part of this individualistic spirit that I can think for myself, that I have something new to say, that you're going to remember, you're going to recognize me for what I have just said. And whatever they write, there's always an author behind it. There's a sense that I am the author of these ideas. So
Yes, yes.
this is one of the ways that I connect this Indo-European aristocratic spirit to the philosophical creativity of the ancient Greeks and Europeans generally.
Yes, I mean, it's really a fascinating read. It really is. And I do think that your argument against the revisionist attitude, perhaps amongst the left within the academic circles, to simply cherry pick certain parts of history in order to fit in with their ideology, I think you dissected that very well and debunked it, and particularly the way that they would dismiss Homer's writings, so Homer's Iliad, and say, oh, it's just like heroic literature from the East. So the Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance. But
Yes.
you did point out that there are very marked differences, and Achilles had a very competitive attitude towards the king. And
Yes.
that was held up as being something virtuous even and worthy of prestige. Obviously, the Epic of Gilgamesh is quite pro the Babylonian Empire, really. And it does come across like a propaganda piece, if anything. So there are very clear differences there. And I think you're absolutely right that it does point to this precursor to what we would call individualism back then. And that doesn't appear to have been some influence from the East. It appears to be a phenomenon going on within the West based
Yes.
on those Indo-European roots. Perhaps if there are influences from the East, as you mentioned, Alexander the Great began to adopt perhaps a more coercive or tyrannical form of government, which affected our view of government here in the West ever since. But something else I wanted to talk to you about, you just touched upon it there, is the influence of Christianity within Europe. You said that as competition of ideas and the expression of thought in writing led to philosophy, that was very different to what we would call the philosophies of the East, where you would have a sage, and the sage would, of course, dictate wisdom or truth, we might say, and that could only really be built upon or adapted ever so slightly by sages who would come afterwards.
Yes.
Particularly in China, that was the case, as opposed to that very strong competition of ideas going on in ancient Greece. With Christianity, of course, we have what was really an Oriental and Eastern religion. It was Judaism, albeit, as Martin Hengel has shown in his work, very much influenced by Greek culture and mythology even during the Second Temple period. And so there was a little bit more individualism, shall we say, and other things that Greeks would be familiar with, which then almost led the way to the rise of Christianity. But really, we couldn't exactly say that Christianity was a Western religion as much as it was adapted during the first few centuries of the rise of Christianity within the Roman Empire. So what would you say? Would you say that Christianity really is, as many would argue, one of those pillars of Western culture, or would you perhaps more agree with Gibbon or Nietzsche even, who viewed Christianity as weakening Europe and even the Roman Empire and leading to the collapse of the Roman Empire? What are the pros and cons, as it were, of the Christian influence within the West?
Well, you're right that Christianity in its origins is a Semitic religion coming from the Jewish people, although you can make connections beyond the Jewish people and show ways in which Christianity borrows certain motifs from Persian religion and other connections. But this is not an argument that I really elaborate in the book. I do
No.
bring it up. I have in subsequent writings engaged this issue more of what is the place of Christianity in the West and in what ways was Christianity altered, developed, or evolved from its earlier Judaic version in the Old Testament into the version that we see in the New Testament, and then beyond that into Catholicism through the medieval era. There is a very rich uh, philosophical, legalistic, intellectual set of influences and novelties that are both generated by Christianity as it evolves and show that Christianity intermixes itself with other currents, philosophical currents, so that what you see in the Old Testament is not enough to say that that is Christianity and that's the Christianity that the West carries throughout its history. In fact, there are arguments out there. There is a very important German scholar who has written many books, and there is this book, the title of which I cannot remember. His name is Hengel, not Hegel, but Hengel, Martin
Yes.
Hengel. Right. So Martin Hengel shows that already among the uh, Jewish prophets, thinkers that you see in the Old Testament, you can see ingredients, concepts that they are borrowing, that are influencing them, that come from the Greek philosophical tradition.
Yes, that's
And
right.
right, and I wrote a bit about this in a recent article. And then after that, when you get into Christianity, you see this further infusion of Greek concepts, the idea of the word, which means, or you can translate it to mean, the beginning is the word. You can say the beginning is logos, it's reason,
Yes.
right? And that idea comes from the ancient Greeks. And then I'm not an expert on this, so I have a very, very general schematic view. But if you look to further development, if you look to the ways in which Christianity was transformed into a theology, which is to say, into a philosophically developed set of Christian beliefs, which is unique to the West, that was only made possible because the first Christian theologians, they became theologians, they did so by using Greek philosophical thinking. And there are many important names. Right now, there's so many names associated with the West that it's hard to remember them on the spot. But there are many important names, these theologians who developed Christianity in a philosophical tradition. And then the Roman contribution also becomes very important, the whole legal administrative tradition of Rome, and also the fact that the Romans created an empire within which Christianity was able to flourish as a universal religion. Otherwise, it would just remain a very parochial, limited religion to various localities. You need, and the Christians understood this. Even Augustine, for all his criticisms of the Roman Empire, he fully understood that without this Roman Empire, there would not have been a possibility for Christianity to develop as a universal religion. But another element that cannot be ignored, and there is a book that is titled The Germanization of Christianity, and that is that then the Germanic peoples themselves also come to influence Christianity. And here, one of the things that I argue in writings subsequent to the book is that, like Oswald Spengler said, that Christianity was transformed by the Faustian spirit of European peoples. Christianity was not this humble, turn your cheek kind of religion through the medieval era. Far from it. I mean, the Knights adopted it, the crusading movement into the Near East was driven by this Faustian aggressive spirit, and the popes were sort of themselves, as Oswald Spengler shows in their personalities. But if you do biographies of them, you see these are very expansive, energetic human beings, not like the Pope of today who says, yes, we should welcome millions of refugees and open our doors to them. That was not the spirit of Christians in the medieval era. So the other thing about Christianity is that you cannot take Christianity out of the West, because the creativity of Europeans through the medieval era in particular would not have been explainable without the important role that Christianity played. Yes, Christianity did pacify to some degree the barbaric side of the Germanic peoples, and that was a good thing, because if you just have this barbaric Faustian energy in its primitive form, it cannot create high culture. So there's a sense in which Christians understood this, and they very carefully, in a very eager way, they fully understood the importance of the Greek-Roman legacy, and they went about preserving it, writing it down. And
Yes,
so,
yes.
yes, and they themselves began to develop institutions that allow for the West to become civilized, the medieval West. They were the creators of universities. I mean, you do see liberal arts education among Romans, but the university as an institution that has many characteristics that we associate today with university, which is to say that you have a curriculum, there are various steps that you need to take in order to be certified properly, that you need certain teachers to teach, that you need a number of disciplines, it's not just religion. In fact, it has been argued by Edward Grant and others that the curriculum of the medieval ages was thoroughly rational. Even theology, again, the word theology means applying philosophy to religion. So, Christianity is so embedded into the West that you cannot extricate it from it.
Yes,
Now,
sure.
as Nietzsche argued, Christianity was dying. He said God is dead by the 19th century, And that did happen, but that's another topic that takes us into the place of Christianity
Yes.
today.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Actually, Hengel was the historian and theologian I mentioned previously as well.
Yes.
It is very interesting to see that in the New Testament, Stoic language and even their literature, as well as Epicurean and Neoplatonic writings, are borrowed quite heavily, especially by Paul in the New Testament. And you're absolutely right. If it weren't for the monasteries and the universities,
Right.
our ancient Greek heritage and that philosophy wouldn't have been preserved for us, and it wouldn't have had a platform in which to
Yes.
infiltrate Northern Europe as well. So we wouldn't know about those things, and it wouldn't have informed our culture and our lives if it weren't for the church. Nevertheless, despite there being an Eastern element of there being the church, the sage, dictating revealed truth to people, as you said, there was this the Germanization of Christianity, and that was basically leading up to the Enlightenment, people taking back an individual sense of spirituality and responsibility for finding truth. Obviously, leading up to the words of Nietzsche that you said there. But throughout all of this, would you agree with Weber, who you quoted as saying that perhaps the defining characteristic of the West could be the attempt to discover a rational, systematic ethic?
Well, I have a long chapter on Weber for a reason, because I do think he is a very significant figure that has now been dismissed by people who study the West. They all claim to have studied him, but they have not. They barely have read him. You might even say not even the Protestant ethic, they barely read carefully. So Weber is a really, really important figure in understanding what makes the West different, and he touched upon something because he spent his life trying to understand the West and wrote many books about other civilizations. He really is the first comparative historian. And what he noticed was that there was this obsessive drive among European peoples that can be traced back to the ancient Greeks to rationalize everything. He noticed this in religion, he noticed this in architecture. Geometry obviously exemplifies it right away in the deductive method. And he noticed it in the way the ancient Greeks were writing history, this idea that you need to document your claims, that you need to be careful and systematic about it, and then this idea sort of further developed in subsequent centuries. He noticed it in the Roman legal tradition. There is nothing like that. The way the Romans wanted to have precise concept and created all these subdivisions within each legal concept and so on. So he is very important in that sense. And then he takes it all the way to the modern era, the modern state, the emergence of bureaucracies, and what you see during the Industrial Revolution, mechanization, and so on.
Right.
So, nevertheless, the thing I found about Weber, and he admits this, is that he doesn't know why ultimately European peoples were so obsessively rational. And it's not just being rational, but it's rationalizing their lives. He doesn't know why. And he
Yes.
speculates. At one point, he speculates and he contemplates the possibility that it may have something to do with race, but he barely gets into it. Now, the left picks on that and says, oh, look, he's a racist, and they won't even allow that line of investigation.
Of course.
So, what I felt later on is that to properly understand Weber, you need to understand Oswald Spengler. Now, Max Weber read Oswald Spengler's book, The Decline of the West, and he was impressed, but he also was not convinced by it. But I do think that they are complementary, these two thinkers. And that what is going on with this rationalizing drive essentially is the Faustian spirit expressing itself in this rationalizing way. Because the Faustian spirit expresses itself in many different ways. The people who explore the world, on the one hand, if you look at the Portuguese as they're rounding Africa and they're mapping the various coasts of Africa for the first time in history, setting up an astronomical institute by Henry the Navigator, as he was called, tracing every step they made over many decades until finally they rounded the tip of Africa. And then, calculating various aspects of their trips and so on. There is a methodological rationalizing impulse here among the Portuguese. And at the same time, another Faustian side about the Portuguese is that they get ships that are with all this heavy artillery, and they realize you have to impose yourself on the Mediterranean. We have to use weapons, and they persist and they produce one great navigator after another in a very quick succession. And so you see this kind of more primitive, barbaric Faustian spirit, which is energy, is I have got to be renowned. I have to get the men in my country and other people throughout history to remember me for what I have done as far as exploration is concerned. But at the same time, the Portuguese are exhibiting this realization that you can really be a good explorer of Africa if you map and methodologically go about doing it rather than recklessly just pushing your way downwards. So I think there you can see how Spengler and Weber can be combined to understand this Portuguese phenomenon, which is then taken on by the Spaniards. And, the left will say, oh, Columbus stumbled into the Americas. He never meant to go there. To his dying days, he didn't know he was in the Americas. He thought he was somewhere in the East Indies. And that is true. But Columbus, the drive, this obsession, again, it's an obsession that he knew or felt I can round the earth and get to the east in a faster way than to the whole Mediterranean or the way the Portuguese were doing it. So you can see it in him, and I mean, he was an excellent navigator. People now know, really took the best possible line to cross the Atlantic in terms of wind patterns and water waves and so on, and the fastest way. And then after him, that's the thing, you can, in the case of the West, it's not just Columbus in isolation, because we are specialists in universities. All these people that you read will get a little bit of something. So they talk about Columbus, and then they don't realize the Portuguese were there before. They don't realize that before the Portuguese, there were other navigational developments during the medieval era. The Vikings were before them,
yes,
and so on. Right, so they don't see the full picture. But after Columbus, you have one after another going into the Americas, going all around the world, so that by the mid 16th century, the whole world has been mapped. This happens already by the mid 16th century, and people have been all around South America. Magellan has circumnavigated the whole earth. People have moved into the St. Lawrence River, into Canada. You see explorers not just from Spain, but from France, from England, from other areas of Europe. So this is part of that energy, that spirit, and it brings about a cartographic revolution. And you cannot have a cartographic revolution unless you have this rationalizing spirit that Weber talked about. So this phenomenon of exploration is a very useful way. I haven't really written about this, but it's a very useful way of understanding the way in which Weber and Spengler reinforce each other and should not be seen as separate thinkers simply because Weber is into the rational side and Spengler is into the rational Faustian side.
And of course, it doesn't have to just be developing rational systems of ethics to the degree that even in early medieval times you had privately run courts. It was everything. It's what led to the rise of what we call modern science. And as you said, the Cartographic Revolution, all these different revolutions. It just seems to be one thing after another as the centuries go on, these tremendous discoveries that propel the people forwards. And it boils down to this one word that I'm left with after reading your book, which is restlessness. And I think for me, that's why it's so key that you draw this all the way back to those Indo-Europeans. Without that, we wouldn't have had the rational restlessness to seek after the truth, and then to even want to devise a system of ethics, a properly systematic universal ethic for all peoples, or modern science, or any of these things. Do you think it's right? Is it fair for me to come away from your book and to think
Yes, I
it's the
think,
restlessness of the
like
Europeans?
you asked me, the first question you asked me is how did you came to this idea that the Europeans were the originators of the West? Well, I also realized as I was thinking about that there was something wrong about the way academics and contemporary men think, and that is that they we live in a very peaceful society. We have been very domesticated, and we really don't understand how men were in the past, how life was in the past. But I will emphasize how men were, that they were very different. I mean, you still see this restlessness in the West, but it really has been domesticated. And that's a whole topic which I'm dealing with now. I mean, well, I already finished my second book, but it has to do with the decline of the West. But the thing is that you cannot, as a quiet academic, earning a safe living, sitting in a room, assume that you're going to understand the West by projecting your personality, your lifestyle onto the past. I met so many academics, very studious, very intelligent, but they really think that the West is about finding men like me in the past, men that were studious, that were civilized. That's what the West is all about. We're not barbarians, and I'm like, no, it's the opposite. You
Yes,
don't look for people like us, because you're not gonna get to the heart of the West.
yes.
These characters, the Portuguese, the Spaniards, the Frenchmen who investigated Canada, and so on, they were so different than us. And you see it in the artists as well. You see it in the philosophers as well. They have very tumultuous, difficult lives. They die very early. Many of them, not all, but many of them die quite young. And so you have to get to something that is immaterial. And that unfortunately, when you look at the foremost academic scholars today, the ones that are cited, they don't read my book and they're not interested in it. What they're writing about is just economic data, quantifying more things, and they think they're so scientific and they really know what's going on. And they are just really dying out exactly what the West is about. So they never will ever understand the West, because the West was not created to peaceful, quantifiable data. It was not created by domesticated bureaucratic characters. It was not a matter of the institutions that surrounded you. Like in the case of Toby Hawk, his work is good, but he has this tendency to think, well, if you only have these institutions, you'll get to the uniqueness of the West. So you're like, yeah, right. So you're going to take these institutions, implant them in Haiti, and then you're going to get a Western society. No, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen also in an Asian society. I mean, they'll get the modern things we have, the technology, but still, they haven't shown themselves to be that creative in many things that we associate with contemporary modernity, that the West still shows itself to be more creative. So it's not a question of the institutions either. I mean, these things are important. I'm not saying that they're part of the puzzle, but I don't think of anyone else who got to this spirit of the West as well as Oswald Spengler did. And when I wrote the book, I wasn't really fully appreciative of this, because Hegel gets this as well. I mean, it was no accident that Hegel began to emphasize dialectics, because you don't understand the West unless you understand dialectics, and dialectics is all about dynamism, continuous interchange with other ideas and conflicted thoughts in your mind, realizing that there were limitations to what you said before and that there are contradictions, and somebody else comes along and says, I'm going to solve your contradictions and tell you what is the proper way to think, and then he thinks he's done it, but then somebody else comes along and demonstrates you wrong. So this is part of the dialectic of the intellectual history of the West. So yes, I mean, the academics today can produce excellent books, but somehow they're projecting their very docile, domesticated persona onto the past, and you're never going to get to understand the West that way.
Why has this happened since the 1960s? This decline, not just in the study of Western civilization, the derogatory term of Eurocentric being used to describe that, but just generally in society. Now we have come to the stage where being a white heterosexual male in itself is loaded with moral pitfalls. Why has it come to this stage, Professor Duchesne, where I can be reading your book on the train, and simply because it says on the cover, the uniqueness of Western civilization, I am given these looks that seem to indicate that lurking beneath this exterior is some sort of racist?
Yes, it is.
How has it come to that?
It is so pathological that it's very hard to answer. It's not difficult to understand, but it is hard to answer because it has many dimensions to it. When I wrote the book Uniqueness, I was still into the idea that this is an intellectual debate that is to make people understand the uniqueness of the West. It's a matter of bringing the sources, bringing the arguments, demonstrating that other viewpoints are wrong, and will show the light to other people. I was already realizing that there was a political dimension to it as to why it is that people are concentrating on just the Industrial Revolution, why someone like Kenneth Pomeranz, who didn't really say anything original in his book other than to bring new facts and quantifying things in a more precise, better way, and he has to be given credit for that. But as far as the ideas are concerned, he was just expressing the ideas of Wallerstein, ideas that everybody else is expressing in university. So I was aware already when I was writing the book that there was this multicultural atmosphere. I say this right in the preface, that there was a multicultural atmosphere, feminism as well, postmodernism and so on, that were looking down on any notion that there was something special about the West, that all cultures are more or less equal, that if anything, the West has done so many bad things that it needs to be criticized continuously for the slave trade and so on and so on. So I was aware of that, but it was really after writing the book that I began to connect this degradation of the West with this emphasis on diversity and immigration. And that is that in every Western society, there is a program to diversify these societies through mass immigration. And under that plan or program, you cannot talk about the specialness of the West. That goes against it. So if you're in a classroom and you have, which is the classroom that they're creating across Western universities, and it is being advocating in every university. I mean, this is really is a program, it's a plan. They want to create diverse classrooms. They don't want to have white majority or white only classrooms anywhere. Then they want to also create a history a curriculum that reflects that diverse background, that welcomes everyone as they see it in an equal way, in which everyone's history is treated equally, everyone's tradition is treated equally. So if you walk into a classroom where you have students from various areas of the world, and you say, you know, I'm going to teach you here about why it is that the West produced almost all the great philosophers in history, the greatest mathematicians, the greatest chess players, the greatest musicians, the greatest painters. It's like, what? You know, the whole administration would even say that's not acceptable. And a student can easily go to the administration and say, look, I felt uncomfortable when this person was acting as if the West was better and unique. I felt uncomfortable, and they will say, well, you cannot do that. And this is just culture. We're not talking even about race or ethnicity or anything like that. There is a new term they have come up with. It's called cultural racism, to cover that kind of emphasis on the West.
Oh my
goodness.
So, I never heard
you
that
know,
one before.
Yes, there is, and there are many dimensions to this. The egalitarian project has been shown to be unsuccessful, and the left realizes that it cannot be successful unless you bring down white men. That the only way to create equality is to allow other groups, to give them an opportunity to rise up no matter how you do it. Many feminists don't like the whole notion that if you study the history of psychology, most of them, practically all of them, are males, and many of them, or most of them again, are from Europe. They don't like that. So, well, we won't teach the history of psychology that much. Or if we teach the history of psychology, they're going to teach it in such a way that it leads to an emphasis on diversity. It is as if Oh, the history of philosophy shows that slowly and gradually all these thinkers were trying to get to where we are today, which is that we need a multiracial society in the West. This is what people like Charles Taylor are saying, what Jurgen Habermas are saying. In my book, I was still praising Jurgen Habermas because at least he recognizes that this universal mind that he talks about, or universal morality that comes about through communication, came out of the West. But then I started reading him more, and I wrote an article about this. Jürgen Habermas, I mean, he basically saying that Germany, if it's to fulfill its universal liberal legacy, it has to be diversified. It has to open its borders to mass immigration. So you're like this is just insane now, and that's sort of what I've been doing lately because I still believe in liberalism. I believe that
Yes, yes,
liberalism
yes.
is inherent to the West. But I do believe that if you follow through with liberalism, not as you mentioned, something happens in the 1960s. I do think that by the 1960s, liberalism has transformed itself into cultural Marxism, and that is something else. They think, like Jürgen
Right.
Habermas, that they're fulfilling the goal of liberalism, but they're not, because a liberal first is someone who believes in open debate, and that means that even if the idea is offensive as they define it today, even if the idea is the idea that I express in my book, well, that's what liberalism is about. You express that idea. And it's not about being offended. It's not about asking for special, should I say, special treatment. It's not about lying, because a lot of what is being taught today in our universities are outright fabrications, outright suppression of the truth. When they say things such as that Canada was from the beginning an immigrant nation, and that was created by immigrants, and that what you see today since the 1960s or 1970s when multiculturalism was introduced is a continuation of past patterns. That's just simply not true. I mean, as of 1971, when official multiculturalism was introduced into Canada, 96% of the population was ethnically European, 96%. And you can go back in time through various statistics. It's more or less always hovering around that number. In other words, Europeans created Canada. You also will find that the native birth rate, take Quebec for example, the native birth rate in Quebec was very high after the English conquered Quebec in 1760s. There was zero immigration coming into Quebec. The population was thoroughly created only to the high birth rate of the Quebecois women. And before that, the people who came in, there were just a few people from France. So the province of Quebec up until 1950 is really heavily homogeneously Quebecois and French. But they want to tell us that no, it was diverse from the beginning, so that now when you see masses of people coming from all over the world, you think that's just natural, but it's not. I mean, they're saying about England as well. It's amazing. I just wrote about this, that England was diverse from the beginning, and it's not true. It was not.
No, no.
Yeah, so I think this is all connected, but I mean, there are other dimensions as to why Westerners are becoming this way. It has to do with the fact that, as many scholars have said from the past, that any culture that rises must at some point decline, and the very success and the affluence that you get from your success will give birth to people who are more complacent, less aware of how difficult it was to build this culture. And then you combine that with cultural Marxism, and you have a recipe for a suicidal situation as we are seeing today.
Yes, I think that sounds about right. Just on a personal level, I'm left feeling resentment, really. I don't feel as though I can teach my children about their European heritage. I'm married and have children with someone who's of a mixed ethnicity, and
Yeah,
it doesn't affect how I feel about her. But I
yeah,
still want to be able to teach my children about the past and why I genuinely believe that the European civilizations are the best for certain reasons. I genuinely believe that. I don't think I should feel ashamed about that. I think we can all
yeah.
have our biases. I happen to still think that I'm right about that. But I resent the idea that I would be considered racist or some sort of monster or antisocial in some way for feeling that and for just wanting to be able to teach my children about their heritage. So then my final question for you really would be, at a time when we are experiencing mass migration into Europe, it's been referred to as a scale of biblical proportions, and at a time, as you say, when we have this cultural Marxism or socialism that dislikes certain aspects of the Western past, so our development of capitalism and certain things like that, and believes that if the native culture is weakened, that will allow a greater scope for the development of leftist ideology within Western countries. As a father, what advice would you give me for the future in order to be able to celebrate and to teach my children about Western culture? And therefore, how could we, as a society, preserve our culture?
Well, the left and the right, because both of them agree on diversity. Conservatives love mass immigration,
That's fair,
cheap
yes.
labor, and they want to break the back of European ethnic cohesion and identity, which is far more difficult to control and to manipulate. They want a population that's ruthless, easy to manipulate, and turn into pure consumers and pure listeners of music. So the left and the right are not going to give you anything. There are segments among the right that still value freedom of expression. They have that plus side to them. And then there are segments on the left that do understand the militaristic character of the United States, these insane wars that they engage in the Near East, and how these wars produce some of these refugee crises. So they have certain aspects to them that are still valuable. But on the issue of diversity and mass immigration, they're not going to concede you an inch, and the left culturally will concede you zero. If you see what I just said, the corporate side, they'll be happy with that, but they will totally hate you if you ever show yourselves to be worried about European culture, to be an admirer of the West, and more than anything, if you say something to the effect that you wish Britain to remain majority white. Even if you say, look, I'm all right with some racial mixing. Personally, in my case, I think 10% will be a number that anything higher than that becomes threatening to the culture. And even 10% is too high in my estimation, depending on fertility rates, because that can switch in just one generation. If that 10% produces 5 children per family and the 90% produces below replacement fertility rate, you can see a dramatic shift in a very short time. So there is no specific number, what's the percentage, but it would vary from country to country. Obviously, in the United States and in Canada, I would come up with sort of roughly different numbers because there is some truth to the fact that these are more immigrant-oriented nations. But if you ever say something to that effect, that you think it should remain majority British because that's part of the character of the British people, and otherwise Britain is just going to look the same as Toronto and Melbourne and Sydney and New York. All these cities are going to start looking alike because, again, it's another lie from these people. They say we believe in diversity. They don't. They want to turn every city to look the same, just like Toronto and Rome and Paris are all looking the same with slight variations in the ethnic composition, but they're all mixed. So if you go against that, they will really completely call you a white supremacist. Even if you say what I just said, that you believe in some diversity, it doesn't matter. They know that's a game they can win in the mainstream media, and they're going to keep pressing on it, and they're not going to concede you an inch. And on many other things, they're not going to concede you an inch. And if you do concede, if you talk in a hesitant way, and this is my experience, if you talk in a hesitant way, I mean, one of the things that is interesting about the West is how they always are asking for apologies. You must apologize for that, because that's a way for them to get you to accept the terms of the debate that they want you to accept.
Yes,
So in the
that's
case
right.
of Trump, they're always saying, why doesn't he apologize? I think one of the most refreshing things about Trump is that he refuses to apologize. because
Right.
he's breaking away this notion of political correctness.
Yeah,
So
that's why
even
people love him, I think. Yeah.
right, they keep wanting him too because as a way of submission, that you have submitted to us. So you must never apologize. And also, they're not going to give you anything. To me, that's what I realized. You're going to have to take it away from them. And unfortunately, they have created a situation in which there's going to be a lot of conflict, a lot of tension, and a lot of violence eventually. So I don't want anything from the left. I don't expect anything from it. And when I say the left, I mean mainstream conservatives. I don't want anything from them. They're not going to give you anything. And so now my view is that you have to have your own movement, your own people, your own groups, engaging a lot of meta politics. Meta politics means that it is very hard. Well, not in Europe. In Europe, you do have alternative so-called right-wing extremist parties, many of which are not extremists at all. In Europe, you do have more political movements, but here in Canada, North America, it's more difficult. So we talk a lot about meta politics, which is a concept that actually came from the European New Right. And what it means is that we have to engage in a lot of, like what we are doing here, is cultural activities, spreading our word. The internet has worked wonders for us because otherwise they had complete control through their journals, universities, and newspapers. But now the young generation really just goes to the internet, and they are beginning to see a lot of things. And once you see certain things, once you see criticism of immigration, of multiculturalism, you can start connecting many other dots and to realize that there is a lot more going on here. And so my advice is that you're on your own. You cannot ever beg them. They might give you a footnote. That happened to me at the beginning. Oh, yes, Ricardo, we hear you. Check. We'll give you a little footnote here. And I hope you're happy right now. And then the whole thing continues. I mean, in my university, the relentless drive for diversity, handing the jobs over to international students that just arrived. They're getting very high paying jobs within the administration against the native students whose parents have been paying taxes all their lives to maintain that university and maintain the professors.
Right. And of course, just favouring people because they're non-white is racist. They're racist. They're just coming at it from the other end of the paradigm, really. So
Yeah.
it's just ironic and it's foolish, really. But thank you for your advice. And I want to personally thank you for the book, The Uniqueness of Western Civilization, because upon reading it, I was given a sense of joy and, yes, just a sense of enjoyment in studying Western civilization and Western history, which I don't tend to get. Scholars will tend to focus on the fact that at one time there was slavery in America or Europe. Well, everyone has practiced slavery, but we were the ones who ended it. And
Right.
we're the ones who fight for freedom. There's so much to celebrate and to love about the West. And I think for the future, we really need to get a firm grasp of what that is. We need to celebrate it. We should endeavour to preserve it. And once we've really understood what that is, we'll stop sending mixed messages to the rest of the world. And obviously, I want to thank you very much for your time now.
All
And
right. Yes,
it's been very, very profitable for me.
yes, I appreciate the talk. I think it was a good one, and you asked very good questions. So
Oh,
I'm
thank
very
you.
glad. Anyway, I won't add anything more. I think I said enough. And that I hope people buy. There is a soft cover version of the book. I don't know if there in the back, I see that you have a copy. I don't know if that's the soft cover or the hard.
That's the soft cover.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can tell. All right, yeah, the soft cover because it's an expensive book in hardcover, and I managed to persuade him to do a soft cover. Brill doesn't do soft cover, but they
Oh,
did
well
it.
done.
It's a bit cheaper, and there are
Yeah.
some stylistic revisions.
I recommend the book to anyone hearing this message. Please go and buy it, read it, deal with the information.
And I have a second manuscript that was just sent. It's not as
Yes.
long, and I may have another third one coming quite soon because I've been writing quite a lot about some of the topics we talked about towards the end of this.
Well, I very much look forward to it.